I woke up one morning and just thought, this sadness that exists within me is never going to leave. It's never going to go. I'm going to have to live the rest of my life, the next potentially 30, 40, 50 years, with this pain, this sadness inside me just chipping away at me, stopping me from being able to live a normal life. And I thought, well, if that's true, if that's my future, I'd rather be dead. And that was the first time I considered taking my own life. And it was a sad day.
Mental health disorders have become one of the major issues that now affect lives across the world. Before now, if you had a mental illness such as depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, or any addictive behaviours, you kept it to yourself because you were afraid of the stigma that society attached to such. This has led to many people taking their own lives. Here in Ireland, for example, 42% of adults have a mental health disorder, and more than 1 in 10 have attempted suicide. These figures came from research by academics from Maynooth University, the National College of Ireland, and Trinity College Dublin. While the government and health industry are doing their very best to tackle this issue, survivors of mental health disorders all agree that being able to speak freely about how you feel without being judged is a major first step towards recovery. And today on this show, I have the honour of presenting one such survivor. In June 2017, Ricky Nuttall was one of 250 first responders who were called to the Grenfell Tower Fire, which claimed 72 lives and injured more than 70 residents in that block of apartments. Ricky suffered from PTSD, and thankfully he's now fully recovered and is now a mental health advocate and public voice, raising awareness on the importance of social and workplace mental health and wellbeing. Ricky, before we get into how you help people to overcome their mental health issues, let me ask you, how are you feeling today?
Yeah, I'm good. I got enough sleep last night, so I've learned over the past few years that sleep is one of the most valuable assets that we have, and generally speaking, in a lot of cases, it's under our own control as well. And if you get enough sleep, you feel good. And so thankfully last night I got enough sleep, and today I feel great.
Good man, I'm happy for you. And before we get into talking about the outcome of the Grenfell Tower fire and how it affected you and your colleagues, let's go back to the very start, and you joined the London Fire Brigade service. What was the environment like when you joined as a young firefighter?
It was, I guess it was a rude awakening, really. I'd worked in an office sort of environment up until then. I should start by saying that the fire service was a job I always wanted. I always wanted to be a firefighter from when I was as young as, I think my mum told me about 4 or 5 years old. I told her one day I'm going to be a firefighter, and she sort of hoped that I would. But as is often the case, I think with kids, you change your mind 78 times as you get older, and you quite often we don't end up in the careers that we hoped we would when we were children. But I was very fortunate that I did end up there. So initially when I joined, I was full of excitement, and I guess I hadn't really paid much mind or given much thought to the impact the job could have on me personally. The environment as a workplace, I would, in all honesty, I would say it's quite a toxic work environment. It's, a lot of this sort of toxic masculinity thing that takes place. So I'm just going to adjust my focus a bit. Yeah, that's better. Sorry. The environment was, quite toxic. This toxic masculinity thing that was going on. When I joined, I joined a station that was on the outskirts of London, and that station was full of sort of old white guys that were a bit sexist, a bit racist, a bit homophobic. And coming from my background, from an inner London school where I was one of 6 white kids, where I've got black family, where one of my best friends is gay, my mum's a woman, there were several elements of that I struggled with, and I challenged. And that meant that my time at that fire station was quite short-lived. I ended up leaving that station and going to a more central station just after a year of being in the service, because I had several arguments and run-ins with people that wouldn't change their behaviours or weren't willing to be educated on their behaviours and a toxicity that existed within them. Thankfully, as my career's progressed, I would say that those sorts of incidents became quite rare. I certainly didn't experience too much of it. However, I am aware that within the fire service, there is still a lot of improvement that is needed in terms of this toxic masculinity, in terms of sexism and institutionalized racism. But as an environment, the social aspect of it aside, as an environment to work in, it was brilliant. It was exciting. It was physical. It was hard work, but it was really, really good fun.
Yeah. Sounds like the army.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly like the army, I think. Yeah, not too dissimilar at all. I mean, it's naval based, so a lot of our procedures, a lot of our words that we use and the commands are all naval based. Knots and lines that we do are all naval based.
Very good. And I imagine, of course, I've lived in London myself. So if you take, sprawling suburbs like Bromley, Croydon, Wembley, for example, and many more, you're going to have a lot of housing estates, low residential housing areas. But as you move further into the city centre and, of course, into the financial district, you're going to have high-rise buildings all around Canary Wharf, for example. So it's a different element to fighting fires in Canary Wharf as would be compared to a domestic house fire. Yeah, of course. So you're going to see all, varieties of fires and training in the London Fire Brigade service. So I would imagine that for any firefighter who's really up for that job, it's going to be a great career. Moving forward to June 2017, and the alarm bell rang in your fire station, and you had to rush out to that Grenfell Tower fire. Now, just to set the scene here, in Dublin, for example, we have height restrictions. So you have very, very few buildings that are above, say, 15 or 16 stories high. What was the height of the Grenfell Tower, for example, in terms of stories?
It's 24 stories.
24. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not the
and
height.
that's not a particularly huge tower block for London either.
Correct. Yeah. So you got to the scene there. The tower block was ablaze. What thoughts were in your head as you entered that building? With all your
well, I mean, I think an important place to start, if you don't mind me saying, is from when the actual call came through to the fire station initially, because for anybody listening that isn't in the service or doesn't know, we have a 60-second turnout time, which means even if we're on a night shift and we're asleep, within 60 seconds, the bells go down. Within 60 seconds of that, we are expected to be dressed downstairs, knowing where we're going and driving the fire engine out the front of the fire station. It's a real rapid deployment. Yep. So the process is the bells go down, you wake up, you chuck your clothes on, down the pole, into the watch room, and you tear off the call slip, which gives us the information of the incident, where we're going, what type of incident it is, who's involved, any injuries, and what other resources are going to the incident. What was unusual on this night is that by the time I got to the watch room, the call slip was still printing. And it was still printing because of the amount of information that was on it, the amount of trucks that were being mobilized, the amount of detail that was required to give us the best sort of start in terms of the information. So I noticed on the call slip the amount of fire engines that were going. I saw it was a tower block fire. So I realized that the chances of this being a false alarm were quite slim, and tower block fires that require that many resources generally are very, very rare. So I knew it was a fairly serious incident. We pulled out the fire station and turned onto the main road. And by that point, I heard a radio message come over that said, we're now making pumps 420. We went on make pumps 12. Now, what that means is that there were, say, 6 fire engines there already. We got the make pumps 12 call, which means us and another 5 are additional resources that are now going. In the 1 or 2 minutes it took for us to get out the station and drive down the main road before that radio message came across, enough had happened at that incident for them to already know that they needed an additional 8 fire engines to make the number 20 in total. So that told me the fire was changing and developing rapidly, which again is not something that we're used to in that short space of time. Normally you've got way more time than that before that sort of level of resources are required. The next message that came over the radio.
That, sorry for cutting. Effectively, what you're saying there is, from the time that bell rang in your fire station to your team exiting the fire station in your fire tender, in a couple of minutes, that fire situation has escalated from maybe 6 firefighting engines to 20. That's serious.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. And the next message that came over the radio was there are now 156 fire survival guidance calls in progress. Now, that won't mean much to a lot of people, so I'll explain. A fire survival guidance call is what happens when you are in a building that is on fire or involved in a fire, and you are unable to self-rescue, but you are affected by the fire. So you'll phone the fire brigade and say, there's a fire in my block. The caller will then say to you, the operator, will then say to the caller, are you affected? Is there smoke coming into your flat? Is there visible flame inside your flat? If the answer is no, then you'll be told, well, stay put because you're unaffected. If the answer is yes, for argument's sake, there's smoke coming in, then the question will be, are you able to get out safely yourself? So they might open the front door, have a check. No, it's too smoky in a lobby area. I can't get out myself. So then they'll be told, stay in your room, stay in your flat or your apartment. They'll be given survival guidance, which the idea of that is to keep them alive, basically, until we are able to get to them to rescue them. So that becomes a fire survivor guidance call. And that operator will then stay on the phone to that caller for the entire time until they're either rescued or they're dead. Now, we have between 8 and 13 control staff on duty at any one time in our control centre. So to have 156 fire survival guidance calls in progress meant that we were already overrun at our control. There was no way that they could cope with that amount of calls. So our calls began to be farmed out to different call centres all over the UK, including Ireland. And their control staff were then helping us by liaising. But what that means is that you've now got a series of messages, a chain of people. It's kind of like the Chinese whispers when you're saying one thing to one person, they've got to relay it. It's inevitable that I would imagine some information was lost in translation. It wouldn't have been as accurate. It wouldn't have been as easy, certainly. So these poor control workers, not just at London Fire Brigade, but all over the UK, they're effectively working blind. They're relying on information from the news and news reports and information from our control, who are already overrun, in order for them to be able to make the right decisions and the right calls and offer the right support and advice to the people that are involved. So hearing that message, 156 fire survival guidance calls, what that tells me is that there are people that will be dying unless we can get to them and we can rescue them. So it was a very sobering moment on the fire engine, and it shocked us all.
Gosh, that is serious. And our hearts go out to the people who passed away as a result of that fire, and also people who suffered life-changing injuries as a result of it.
Yeah.
So before you got to the actual tower itself, your heart was racing in your mouth nearly, and you knew this situation was extremely, extremely serious. And
yeah, the incident starts for us as soon as the call comes through. Our minds are already in work mode. We're already thinking about resources. We're already thinking about procedures, protocols, what we might need to do, how we're going to deal with any issues that we face along the way. So the journey there was filled with anticipation, a little bit of fear, and a very sobering understanding of the size of the task at hand. But to be honest with you, nothing could have prepared us for what we saw when we arrived. When we actually got there, considering we were there fairly early on, I could see flames from the 4th floor all the way up to the 24th floor in almost like a straight line up the outside of the building, and then all the way back down again to around the 15th, 16th floor. That was hugely unusual, because at a tower block fire, you would expect to find fire in a window or maybe two windows, but you don't expect to see so many flats already involved across multiple floors and with a very, very irregular external burn pattern. External fire spread is something that we are trained to deal with, but it usually is caused by specific reasons. We call it a chimney effect. If there's a fire in a flat, the flames can jump from flat to flat along the outside of a building because of open windows and wind patterns. If the wind's blowing a certain way, it will drag the flames up, set light to some curtains or some nets or whatever, and then the fire can get into that flat. Hot embers blowing away on the wind from one room can make it into another flat and get in there.
Understand?
But fire spread on the actual building across that many floors was highly, well, I say highly unusual. It's something we'd never seen before.
So in other words, when you were there, when you actually got to the location, you weren't exactly prepared for what you saw, I suppose you could say. Yeah.
No, I always describe it as organized chaos. Everyone knew what they were doing. Everybody had a job, but everybody was sprinting. Everyone was running. Everyone was shouting. Everyone was doing everything as quickly as possible. The sense of urgency with the deteriorating situation was not lost on anybody there. So whilst it would appear chaotic to an untrained eye, we did know what we were doing, and we were doing the right things. We were just doing them extremely fast because we knew we needed to.
Yeah. Effectively, you were kind of swimming against the tide, I suppose you could say, that you were.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a daunting task when you're looking, and bearing in mind we all have the information about the fire survival guidance calls, so we know that people's lives are at stake. And as you said, it's a more eloquent way of saying it, swimming against the tide. I was going to use a different phrase involving wind and urine, but I won't. It was it was a job when we're looking at it and we're going, this is really bad, and this is going to take a hell of a lot out of all of us to make this okay.
Of course, that's perfectly understandable. Yeah. So you were dealing with a very, very serious situation that was, escalating very, very quickly. It was running under control almost. Everybody was doing their very, very best to help the residents in the tower blocks to get to safety. But people were, effectively racing against time, I suppose you could say. The situation had just got so serious so quickly that people's lives were at stake, not just the residents who passed away or who suffered life-changing injuries, but also the firefighters inside in the tower block who were trying their very, very best to deal with an awful situation. So it was some scenario to deal with, yeah. So you went to that building and you did your very best, along with all your colleagues from the London Fire Brigade and all the other emergency services. How did that fire affect you as a person immediately afterwards?
Immediately afterwards, I would describe myself as a bit lost, a bit numb. I wasn't really suffering immediately afterwards. I think my brain was scrambling to try and make sense of it all, to try and make sense of the sheer size of the fire itself, the sheer size of the loss of life. It was heartbreaking. And I guess it was probably a couple of weeks after the fire that, looking back now, I can see some real changes, some real problems starting that I probably didn't see at the time. But ultimately, what happened was my mental health deteriorated to the point where I became a terrible father. And when I say that, I mean I was aggressive with my son. I would smack him, but I would lose my temper whilst doing so. And in fairness, I was smacking him over things that he didn't need to be smacked for. Over the last 3 years, 4 years, I haven't smacked him at all. I haven't needed to. I don't ever see a need to smack him again. because I found better ways of dealing with things. I've learned better ways of dealing with things. But at the time, my first port of call was verbal aggression or physically smacking my son. When it came to my partner, it was never physical, but it was I had such anger and hatred for her that was completely unwarranted. Nothing more than a normal argument, a normal disagreement that exists in relationships would feel like a huge assault on me as a person. I would feel like she is deliberately and directly attacking me to make me feel bad. It was all about me. And I would react with such huge levels of verbal aggression. Now, I remember once that we had a huge argument, like I absolutely lost the plot. And that was over her not putting forks in the dishwasher in the correct slots. Yeah. And when you say that out loud, you just think, wow, like how bad have you got to be? How bad has your mental health got to be for you to react so aggressively to somebody that you love over something so small? And that was the problem. My everything was heightened. My emotional reaction to things was heightened. My physical reaction to things was heightened. My responses were heightened. The pain was heightened. My sadness was heightened. Everything was extreme. Nothing felt normal anymore. And I felt, again, looking back, I didn't realize at the time, but looking back now, I was really scared. I was so scared because I did not know or understand what was happening to me. I didn't understand why all these feelings were so extreme. I didn't understand why everybody was turning against me, because that's how it felt. It felt like everybody in my life had turned against me overnight. I can't do anything right. I'm always wrong. I'm always aggressive. I'm always angry. Everybody else is always doing everything right, and I can't get anything right at all. And it was a scary, scary place to be. And unfortunately for me, that meant that I descended into alcohol and drug use. And with that, obviously, things only got worse. I spiraled more. I would stay out for 2 days at a time and not come home. I would ignore my son when I was home. My partner at the time could, it was all she could do just to keep things afloat, keep me afloat. And things ultimately got so bad that I would spontaneously burst into tears. And again, I didn't understand why. There was not necessarily a reason at the time why I would burst into tears. I just would. I'd be there, everything would be fine, and then suddenly I'd be in tears. And it was sobbing, like real heartbreak sobbing. It wasn't just, a watery eye. It was crying like you do at a funeral. And it would just come over me suddenly for no reason, and that'd be me done for half an hour. I wouldn't be able to speak to anybody. I wouldn't be able to go anywhere. And that meant that I felt trapped, because I know that wherever I am, whatever I'm doing at any given moment, I could burst into tears, which meant I started to avoid social situations and people. I would only ever be in environments where that wasn't going to be an issue, like a nightclub, for instance, because that's not an environment in which you're going to cry. But at home, a news report would come on. I'd hear the word Grenfell. I'd see a tower block. Anything like that would just reduce me to tears immediately. And it made my life a living hell. And things got so bad to the point where I woke up one morning and just thought, this sadness that exists within me is never going to leave. It's never going to go. I'm going to have to live the rest of my life, the next potentially 30, 40, 50 years, with this pain, this sadness inside me, just chipping away at me, stopping me from being able to live a normal life. And I thought, well, if that's true, if that's my future, I'd rather be dead. And that was the first time I considered taking my own life. And it was a sad day.
Gosh, this is a great story and a very heart-rendering story. Gosh, really, my heart goes out to you, Ricky. You went through an awful lot. And may I ask you a question there? Because going back to the mid-80s, you had the King's Cross fire,
Yeah.
underground fire, and so many people lost their lives because of a cigarette on a wooden escalator, and it caused massive fire. Then you have the Grenfell Tower Fire in 2017, which you were involved with. Was there any service available within the fire brigade service in London for people like yourself to go forward voluntarily and say, I have a mental health issue here as a result of being a firefighter at Grenfell Tower. I need help?
The short answer is yes. There's a counselling and wellbeing team. Unfortunately, due to funding, that team's been cut somewhat in recent years, and because of that, you're allowed a maximum of 15 sessions with a counsellor, which means the first thing you're aware of when you walk into a room to open up to a counsellor is that if you're not fixed in 15 hours, you're out the door. So I can't speak for other people, but I know what I did was I tried to steer the conversation in the direction of the areas that I thought needed most work, which then means you're effectively hindering the counsellor from doing their job properly because you're steering the conversation. I'm leaving things out that I don't think are important because I'm aware that I'm running out of time. And it's a real horrible place to be when you're broken as a human being and you feel like you're against the clock in terms of how long you've got to be fixed. That should be a timeless thing. If you go to the gym to do a workout and someone says to you, you've got to be this strong, you've got to be able to lift these weights by this date, and it's an unrealistic target, you either give up straight away and you say, well, there's no point doing this then because I can't get there. Or you take shortcuts, try and increase the load of the weight too quickly and end up injuring yourself and not making that target anyway. And I think that with counselling, if you're given a time frame, if you're given a limit to the amount of help you're going to be given, then effectively what that person is saying to you is you're going to have to take some shortcuts and risk injuring yourself more. And what happened for me is that I opened a can of worms on a violent childhood, on broken relationships, on insecurities, on not only Grenfell, but many, many other incidents that I've attended that have left an emotional scar and an emotional footprint on me. And that, all of that stuff came to the fore. It all came out and I never got to finish it. I shortcutted my way through so many of those things in order to try and be healed by the 15th session. So when you're told you have a limited amount of time to get well, it means you take shortcuts, and that's what I did. And so when I left my counselling process, I knew I wasn't healed. I knew I wasn't brilliant, but I knew that I had no other options. And so unfortunately for me, the next sort of 2 years were a roller coaster ride of feeling like I was getting somewhere, feeling like I was healing, and then realizing that I was nowhere near healed, nowhere near as far down the line of progress as I thought that I was. And it meant that I made lots of mistakes along the way. I lost relationships, I lost friendships. I've only just now got to the point where my relationship with my son is good. Because, I literally last night, I've had him this weekend, and we were watching Mrs. Doubtfire. Brilliant film, old school. He found it very funny. But there's a part in there where, it's all about a family splitting up and coming apart. And he said to me that I think it was sort of 6 months or so after the fire, I'd moved out, my relationship had broken down, and he didn't want to come and see me. He was scared of me. And he used to say to his mum, I don't want to go to Daddy's. I don't want to go to Daddy's. And she used to say, well, you've got to, mate, because, you need to maintain a relationship with him. You've got to go and see Daddy. And she didn't understand why he didn't want to come, but it was because he was scared of me. And as a dad who absolutely loves the bones of his son, it's heartbreaking to think that the person I love most in this world didn't even like me at one point. And if ever there is a warning for anybody who is suffering with poor mental health to any extent, get help, and get it soon and do it right, because it doesn't matter, if even if you're paying £80 for an hour's session and you've got to do that, 4 times a month, that is a lot cheaper than losing a relationship with your son. I can guarantee that.
It's very, very good advice. And I agree with you there that your mental health is your wealth, to be quite honest. And everybody needs relationships with people because we're all human beings. We're all into human contact. We all need family around us because we never know the day when we do become ill, for example, mentally or physically, and we need help and we need people in our family we can confide to. So we all need that human connection. That's very good advice. I agree with you there.
Definitely. And the other thing I would add to that as well is, I think people have a quite a negative view of poor mental health. They, in counselling and stuff, men particularly don't want to talk about it and don't want to deal with it. And what I would say is that if you broke your leg, you would go to the hospital, you'd go to the doctors, you'd get help, you'd have your leg put in plaster, you'd do whatever it was you needed to do in order to get fixed. Well, a mental health injury is no different to that, only the consequences are much more severe. A broken bone will be healed in 6 weeks. A broken mind's taken me 5 years plus, and I'm still not fully there. I'm still working on it. I'm still trying to do better each day, but I still have bad days, and that's with help. So, a broken mind is more important and more severe, and it's a more serious injury than a broken bone. So if we're going to go to the hospital over a broken bone, for God's sake, get some help when it comes to your mind.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue is that people feel they're going to be judged if they speak up to a family member to say, "I'm struggling mentally. I'm not in a good position. My confidence is very low. My relationships with people are very low in a very poor way. I'm struggling at work. I have been taking too much drink or I'm abusing drugs, for example. I need help." And they feel they're going to be judged by their family member or friend or colleague at work. And I think that's probably the biggest reason why people are loath or unwilling to step forward and talk up.
Yeah, I think that probably is the case. But do you know what I would say to that? Some very simple advice. If you're going to make yourself vulnerable and you're going to put yourself out there and open up to somebody, particularly if it's a close friend or a family member, and that person judges you or treats you differently in a bad way, doesn't offer you the support or love that you deserve, that is not a reflection of you. That's a direct reflection of them. That's a reflection of their shortcomings, their inadequacies, and their problems, not yours. So open up anyway, because at very worst, all you're going to do is give them an opportunity to show you that they're not doing well either.
True, true. I know what you're saying there. Yeah. Yeah. It's a reflection on them, not of you.
Exactly. Yeah.
For yourself, you're doing the right thing. If people decide to, treat you badly in return, that's their responsibility. That's their issue. It's not your issue.
Yeah.
Of
Exactly.
course.
And
Yeah.
when I do motivational talks and stuff at the moment, one of the titles of an entire talk is about strength through vulnerability. And it's about how strong you can be when you're at your weakest, when you're at your emotionally lowest, when you're struggling the most. Open up. Give people everything they need to either support you or attack you. And you'll find that in actual fact, they'll realize just how strong you are at your weakest moment. Because in your weakest moment, if you've survived, how strong must that make you when you're at your strongest? You know,
Yeah.
it's that's I think how we need to look at things. When you're in that moment where I was, when I was suicidal, when I was an alcoholic, when I was abusing class A drugs, when my relationship had fallen apart, I was on my own. My son didn't like me, let alone love me. I had nothing and no one. I survived. I wouldn't wish anybody to be there, and I certainly hope I'm never there again, but I survived. And what that gives me now is an infallible belief in my inner strength. if that didn't kill me, if that didn't break me, if that didn't stop me, nothing is ever going to.
Yeah, because it's often said, Ricky, for example, if you take Greater London, there's nearly 10 million people, probably over 10 million people in that,
Yeah.
conurbation. Now, you think in a big city like that, you'd never be lonely. But at times, London can be a very lonely city.
I felt lonely in rooms full of people. Loneliness isn't a physical act of being around people. Loneliness is feeling isolated emotionally and mentally. It's not a physical thing, loneliness. You can be on your own all day, every day. And God knows people have done this getting through lockdown. People who don't have a partner or children, they live alone and they're in the middle of lockdown. They were alone, but they may not have been lonely. If they've got friends they can speak to, conference calls to do, Zoom calls like we are now, that stops you feeling lonely. But what poor mental health did for me was it removed my want to have those conversations with anybody. And it removed my feeling of interaction. I didn't want to interact with people, even though they were in the same room as me, which meant even in a room full of people, I was still lonely. I felt alone in my pain. I felt alone in what I was going through. I felt weak and broken and pathetic and like a failure. I felt like I'd failed my son. I'd failed my family. I'd failed the fire service. I'd failed everybody. I'd failed myself. And that's a very lonely place to be. And it's only when you start to heal and you start to realize, in actual fact, I haven't failed those people. Those people are there. Those people are waiting for me to get better. Those people are trying to help me get better. They're there to support me and to help me and to drag me along if they need to. And they were all there and they were all doing that. But my pain and sadness meant that I couldn't see that for what it was, which is exactly why they say taking your own life is a very permanent solution to a very temporary problem in most cases.
Very true. I agree with you there. What advice do you have for people who want to come forward and ask for help for a mental health or an emotional well-being issue?
The biggest thing I learned through all of this was the more you talk, the more you realize you're not the only one. So my advice would be talk as much as you can. I got myself to a point where somebody would say, "How are you, Rick?" And I would say, "Are you asking how I am, or are you saying hello?" Because they're two very different things. Do you have 20 minutes? Because I will open up. I will tell you a lot, and you might not want that. So, what are you asking me? And generally speaking, I'd say it's probably a 50-50 split. Some people were just saying hello and really don't want you to unload and tell them everything that's going on with you. And some people would go, "No, God, I want to know how you are, mate. Like, what's going on? How are you?" And as soon as you start talking about mental health, as soon as you start talking about your struggles and your problems, people go, "Oh, God, I remember when I felt like that, when this happened or when that happened, or, oh, my friend such and such feels like that when this goes on." And you start to realize, wow, I'm not the only one. I'm actually not on my own. And in actual fact, so many people are struggling out there. And whilst you don't want everyone or anyone, in fact, to be struggling, there is an inherent comfort in knowing that you're not the only one. The phrase "misery loves company" I used to feel like that meant, and it probably does to an extent mean that if you are miserable and unhappy and grumpy, they're the people that you're going to attract. They're the ones that are going to come into your life because misery loves company. How I also view that phrase is that if I'm struggling with my mental health, if I'm depressed or if I'm suffering with PTSD, and I have a friend who also is, that makes me feel a little bit better. Not because they're struggling, but because I'm not the only one. You can associate with someone. You know that you're not weak. Somebody else is going through that as well. And in that respect, misery loves company. We sometimes the biggest comfort we have is knowing someone else is just as miserable as me. And that sounds like a really negative, mean thing to say, but it's really not. It's just knowing that you belong somewhere with someone and that you're not the only person.
I understand what you're saying there, Ricky. And do you ever foresee in life that one day perhaps you'll be able to go out there, be yourself again, without the need for counselling services?
It's always a really interesting question when I get asked this, because I used to say, yeah, I hope one day I will be absolutely fine and I won't need a counsellor or any sort of additional support, and I'll be great. For the most part, I'm there already, for the most part. But I now view mental well-being in the same way that I view physical well-being. You don't wait until you're obese and unfit and have a letter from the doctor saying you're going to die if you don't make changes to your life before you hit the gym. Because if you do, you're not treating yourself right. You're doing yourself a disservice.
True.
Go to the gym every day, every other day, twice a week, whatever it is. Maintain. The gym is for maintenance, not for creation. It's for maintenance. Maintain your physical well-being. And for me now, I view mental health the same way. Maintain your mental well-being. I don't ever want to be without a counsellor. I always want to be able to talk. And a counsellor doesn't have to be a trained person. It doesn't mean you've got to pay money to go and see someone in a room and talk to a stranger about your feelings. I counsel myself. I use other people to counsel me. I bounce ideas off people. I've been feeling like this lately. What do you think? Sometimes people go, I haven't got a clue, Rick. Sometimes people go, oh, well, funnily enough, I watched a program about that the other day, or I read a book about this and it said this and said that. It can give you some insight. It can give you an avenue for you to explore. And sometimes that's enough. So, no, I don't ever think I will be without need for additional support or some form of counsel. I don't think anyone ever should. I think we should always work on ourselves, mentally and physically, so that we can be the best versions of ourselves. And if we neglect our mental health, even down to small things like stress at work, everyone suffers from stress at work, but we deal with it and we just don't realize maybe that we're dealing with it when we do. We deal with it by being social in the pub after work one day with some colleagues, and we have a bit of a moan about, the manager or, John in accounts or whoever it is that we're moaning about. You have a moan about that person and it's a release, it's a counsel. And then you go, oh, I feel better about that now. And we never notice those things because that's normal life. But that is maintaining your mental health. We need to find the avenues that work for us and exploit them.
This has been a great conversation to have today with you, Ricky. So what I've taken away from this conversation is, firstly, with all your training in the London Fire Brigade, I don't think anything really prepared you for what you saw and heard en route to the Grenfell Fire some years ago in 2017. All your training helped you to kick in there and do your very best in the day. But the situation escalated so quickly that the work of the firefighters like yourself and your colleagues was made much more difficult. And then, as you said also, the fact that you had to rely on call centres all around the UK and into Ireland to help the people who were affected directly by the fire, to give them some support online. The whole situation really escalated way beyond the normal bounds of control, I suppose you could say. Secondly, you were offered counselling services, but as you said today, time-based or hours-based counselling services don't work. You might become partly fixed, but the problem continues, and counselling has to continue on and off right throughout your life. It's never an hours-based or time-based facility. You never know when you're going to need that counselling service. I also got the impression today that you have to hit rock bottom before you can really start to resolve issues in your life. And I think what you've also said today is, if people have issues, speak up to family members, close friends. Never be alone. Never think you can solve your issues by yourself. Speak to relevant professionals or speak to close confidants in your family or close friends. If they listen to you and don't judge you, that's a major step forward. So thank you for your time today, Ricky. It's been a great pleasure having you on this Gift Show special segment. And I'd love to thank you for all your time and for sharing a really heartening story. It takes great courage and conviction to do that. Well done to you.
You're welcome. Thanks very much for having me on. I've had a great time.
And if anybody has been watching this video today, and you've got personal experience of mental health or well-being issues, I'd love you to share your story or in the comments section below. Thank you.